When a young George Washington began marching into the Ohio Valley, war yet again erupted between Britain and France to decide the fate of North America. However, this war would, arguably, be their final war to control the continent once and for all. The French and Indian War would be waged on an unprecedented scale unseen in the previous three clashes, and in doing so, one side would have to annihilate the other. Part 1. A Race for Empire. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 ended yet another war between the British and French colonies in North America, but it did not stop them from expanding inland. Inevitably, their settlers, traders, and soldiers clashed again, each side trying to claim more land in the name of the kings. One such conflict happened in Acadia, now Nova Scotia. The British had controlled it since 1713, but its borders were still unclear. To strengthen their claim, they founded Halifax in 1749 to counter the nearby French fort of Louisbourg. This angered the local Acadians and Mi'kmaq people. They united under the Catholic priest Jean-Louis Le Loutre to push the British out. The French, still holding on to nearby Prince Edward and Cape Breton Island, built Fort Beauséjour in 1751 to challenge the British Fort Lawrence. The more important conflict took place in the Ohio Valley, which both the French and British saw as the next key component to their colonial empires in America. The French wanted to link their colonies in Canada and Louisiana and saw the Ohio Valley as crucial for control. The British wanted to expand west and prevent the French from blocking their colonies westward, and keep the Ohio Valley open for British trade and settlement. Both sides claimed the land. The British claimed the valley through some of the earliest colonial charters, which stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Iroquois Confederacy claimed the Ohio Valley by conquest, but sold the land to Britain in 1744. The French claimed the land based on Explorer La Salle's alleged discovery of the Ohio River in 1679. However, this claim was likely based more on an exaggerated interpretation of his ambiguous journals, and La Salle likely never saw the Ohio River. Virginia, whose charter into the Ohio, eagerly started granting land to settlers. In 1749, the Ohio Company of Virginia was given 200,000 acres of land, and the promise of 300,000 more if they could settle 100 families. The French responded by sending Captain Pierre-Joseph Saluin de Blainville to mark their claim. He led an expedition in 1749, traveling through New York and down the Ohio River, posting signs and burying metal plates to stake French territory. He warned local British traders to leave, but knew the British offered better goods and at lower prices than the French, and many indigenous groups preferred to trade with them instead. Part 2. The Flashpans of Conquest. In 1752, the French governor, Marquis Duquesne, planned to extend French rule into the Ohio Valley, not just trade. The French built a fort on Sandusky Bay and proceeded to attack a British-friendly Miami village. They burned it and killed its chief, nicknamed Old Britain for his loyalty. They also began building more forts in Pennsylvania. Virginia, led by Governor Robert Dinwiddie, received permission from London to build forts of their own in the Ohio Valley. In 1754, Governor Dinwiddie asked the young George Washington to lead 200 soldiers to protect the new British fort at the fork of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, at what is now Pittsburgh. The troops, however, were not ready until April 2nd and had only 120 men, The French, with a much larger force, took over the British fort and built Fort Duquesne. Washington still moved to reclaim the area. On May 28th, Washington's men attacked a group of French soldiers. Their leader, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was captured and interrogated by Washington. During the conversation, Washington's Seneca ally, Tanaquarcion, went up and unexpectedly smashed in Jumonville's skull with a tomahawk. Jumonville's brother, Coulon de Villiers, led a French force to seek revenge. Washington, short on supplies and facing bad weather, built Fort Necessity in the nearby Great Meadows. On July 3rd, the French attacked in the rain and forced Washington to surrender. He signed a document written in French, not realizing it made him admit to killing Jumonville. After this loss, Virginia asked for help from London. While waiting, Dinwiddie split the militia, lowering Washington's rank in the process. Frustrated, Washington resigned and returned to managing his family's Virginian plantation, Mount Vernon. In June, representatives from 7 of the 13 British colonies met in Albany, New York, to strengthen ties with the Iroquois and plan for defense. The Iroquois raised concerns about land, rum supplies, and unfair trade, but left on good terms after receiving many gifts. The delegates also discussed Benjamin Franklin's plan for colonial union and joint defense. In this union, a President General would be appointed by the British Crown and a Grand Council elected by the colonies. Surprisingly, all the colonies rejected it. By February 1755, Major General Edward Braddock arrived to lead the British forces in North America. Washington joined him as a volunteer aide. The British had 3 goals. Braddock was to attack Fort Duquesne. William Johnson, a trusted diplomat with the Iroquois, was to target Fort St. Frederick, and there were plans for a campaign in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton quickly captured Fort Beauséjour. Father Le Loutre managed to escape, but his years-long war with the British did more to damage Anglo-Acadian relations than help it. The British ordered the Acadians to swear an oath of loyalty, but they refused. Knowing that they would refuse, the British used their refusal as justification for their forced deportation in July, scattering thousands across the colonies. Even despite the deportation, many Acadians swore loyalty to the British Crown in the years to come so that they could return home. Many more found a new home in Louisiana, where they eventually became Cajuns. Meanwhile, Braddock's expedition into the Ohio Valley moved slowly. The French and their indigenous allies, led by Captain Daniel de Beaujeu, prepared for the inevitable attack on Fort Duquesne. On July 9th, Beaujeu's force ran into the British. Beaujeu was killed in the initial skirmish, but the French quickly reorganized and attacked on both sides. The British, led by Colonel Thomas Gage, fell back under heavy fire. Even Braddock arrived to rally his troops, but his horse was shot out from under him in the deafening chaos, and was mortally wounded soon after. The 3-hour battle was a disaster for the British. Out of 86 officers, 63 were killed or wounded, and nearly 1,000 of the 1,450 troops were killed or wounded. The French, on the other hand, suffered fewer than 60 casualties. Braddock's defeat left Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania vulnerable to French and indigenous attacks. After Braddock's death, Massachusetts Governor William Shirley took charge as Commander-in-Chief. Shirley aimed for Fort Niagara, while William Johnson was still expected to target Fort St. Frederick. Johnson gathered 3,500 men and 400 native allies to attack Fort St. Frederick at the south end of Lake Champlain. When he learned of a nearby French force, Johnson sent 1,000 men to attack them, but they were ambushed. The French won their first skirmish that day, but lost his later battles and had to retreat. Johnson did not advance on Fort St. Frederick, and instead built Fort William Henry on Lake George. Shirley's efforts in New York faced problems. He moved west with 2,400 men towards Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario, which was to be used as a staging ground for his attack on Fort Niagara. He strengthened the fort, but had to delay the attack on Fort Niagara due to rain, illness, and supply shortages. He eventually left his men at Oswego and returned east in October. In December, Shirley drew up a plan to attack Forts Niagara, St. Frederick, Duquesne, and the city of Quebec with a total force of 16,000 men. His plans were too expensive, and many of the colonies refused to support them. His grand plans made him unpopular, and in March 1756, Shirley was called back to London. John Campbell, the Earl of Loudon, replaced him, but would accomplish little. It may be surprising that, until May 18, 1756, Britain and France were not officially at war. But the fighting in North America forced both into war, which then spread to Europe. This conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, and in America as the French and Indian War, became a truly global war with battles spanning many parts of the world, including the West Indies, Africa, India, and the Philippines. Britain, Prussia, and Portugal had to fight a much larger faction made up of France, Austria, Saxony, and Russia. Whoever would win this monumental clash of empires would come out as the foremost European power. Part 3. French Ascendancy. Lieutenant General Loudon now led the expanded British forces in North America, with two other generals, James Abercrombie and Daniel Webb, assisting him. However, Abercrombie was chosen for political reasons and lacked leadership skills, while Webb was cautious and lacked confidence. Loudon himself, although experienced, was considered uninspired and short-tempered. Meanwhile, the Marquis de Montcalm, an experienced and daring leader, arrived in Quebec in May. Unlike Loudon, he had strong officers like the Chevalier de Lévis and de Bourlamaque. However, he reported to the new Canadian-born governor Marquis de Vaudreuil-Carmagnole, who was jealous of French-born officers like Montcalm and indecisive under pressure. Montcalm quickly took action and captured Fort Oswego in August, after finding it weakened by the winter. During the surrender, 80 people were killed, many unexpectedly by Montcalm's indigenous allies. In response, Loudon called for more militia reinforcements, but the colonies were reluctant to provide them. Virginia's militias, led by the newly promoted Colonel George Washington, built Fort Loudon in Winchester and fortified its frontier. Pennsylvania also built defensive posts. No major campaigns occurred for the rest of 1756, as Loudon focused on future plans to attack Quebec. In Britain, William Pitt became the leader of the House of Commons in December 1756, and brought a new revitalizing outlook to the war. Pitt believed Britain's power depended on expanding its colonies. He aimed to defeat France by taking its colonies rather than fighting its large army in Europe. He instructed Loudon to first capture Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which controlled the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and therefore was key to reaching Quebec and Montreal. Loudon's attack would not be the first time the British attacked the fort. In 1745, in King George's War, The British were able to successfully take the fort, but had to give it up in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Preparations began in May, but delays and bad weather gave the French time to strengthen Louisbourg's defenses. When the British fleet finally set sail in August, they faced the risk of meeting a stronger French fleet. Loudon decided to return to New York, and the British reinforcements sent to him were caught in a hurricane on their way back to Britain. The French capitalized on the British failure. Montcalm decided to attack Fort William Henry, which had become a well-built and therefore formidable fort. Its closer proximity to Albany made communication to British reinforcements quicker, while communication between Montcalm and Governor Vaudreuil was in a falling out, disrupting coordination. Despite tensions, Montcalm gathered a large and diverse force of over 8,000 soldiers, including many indigenous warriors, and began the siege on August 3, 1757. The fort, isolated and under heavy artillery fire, surrendered on August 9th. Montcalm allowed the defenders to leave with their weapons if they promised not to fight for 18 months. However, his indigenous allies, feeling betrayed because they were not allowed to take plunder or captives, took what they wanted anyways. Just as the last soldiers followed out, the natives entered the fort and killed many of the wounded, took others captive, and caused widespread panic. By the time order was restored, about 185 people were killed, and up to 500 were captured. Many of Montcalm's indigenous allies left and did not return to fight for New France again. In late 1757, Pitt took bold steps. He replaced Loudon with Abercrombie, called for a large invasion of Canada, and promised financial support to the colonial troops. This encouraged the colonies to contribute more. Pitt called up 24,000 regular troops from Britain and 25,000 provincial troops from the colonies. This committed Britain to a significant war effort and debt, but it was worth its cost, for it was to utterly crush the French. Part 4. British Resurgence. Most of the British soldiers sent to America were sent to capture Louisbourg. The rest went with General Abercrombie and local militias to invade Canada through Lake Champlain. By July 4th, he had gathered an army of 16,000 men. The army set out across Lake George and landed on its west side on the night of July 5th. Montcalm's army was struggling. They only recently got their food supplies in mid-June, and had trouble moving troops to Fort Carillon, later known as Fort Ticonderoga. The fort, which was just south of Fort St. Frederick, was small and could only hold a few hundred men. Montcalm built extra defenses outside the fort using fallen trees. He put his commanders, Lévis and Bourlamaque, in charge of his right and left wings. Despite his efforts, Montcalm knew he was in trouble. He was outnumbered 5-1, and the British had about 40 cannons. The fort was also open to attack from a nearby hill called Mount Defiance. On July 6, Lord Howe, Abercrombie's trusted and well-respected second-in-command, led a group of British soldiers into the woods. They bumped into a French scouting team and defeated them, capturing 150 men. But Lord Howe was killed, which hurt their army's morale and was seen as a sign of more bad things to come. Without Howe, Colonel Thomas Gage became Abercrombie's new second-in-command. Abercrombie made two big mistakes. First, he trusted the French prisoners who claimed Montcalm had only 6,000 men, and it would get reinforcements soon. Second, he decided to use this opportunity to attack without waiting for his cannons. He sent his men up Mount Defiance, but their muskets were useless, and they gained nothing. On July 8th, Abercrombie led a war council and decided on a direct attack. Without using his cannons, his men launched 6 assaults against the French defenses. All 6 failed. Abercrombie finally called off the attack at 7 p.m. The British suffered heavy losses, with 464 killed, 1,117 wounded, and 29 missing. They retreated back through the woods to their boats. Abercrombie's decisions led to a disaster. The French were also tired and worried. They had about 400 casualties, and Bourlamaque was seriously wounded. Montcalm expected the British to attack again with their cannons, but by morning, the British were gone. Montcalm was thrilled. The French had won again. But their luck was about to change. Preparing to conquer Louisbourg, William Pitt chose 3 skilled officers from Europe. Geoffrey Amherst, 41 years old, steady and reliable. James Wolfe, 31 years old, experienced but in poor health. And Edward Whitmore, a veteran of the War of the Austrian Succession. The expedition, with 9,000 regular soldiers and 500 colonial troops, left Halifax on May 28th. Fog delayed their landing until June 8th, but soon after, the British took over much of the harbor north of the fortress. The British slowly moved their siege lines closer to Louisbourg and began bombarding the town. The French tried to break through their lines but failed. The town suffered more and more damage, and 3 French ships burned after a shell hit a gunpowder magazine. By July 26, only 4 French cannons were left, and the French surrendered. The British victory at Louisbourg showed they were getting strength in the war. Despite their loss at Ticonderoga, Abercrombie's army launched a bold attack on Fort Frontenac, now Kingston, Ontario, a major French supply base. Governor Vaudreuil did not think the British would attack from the west, so the fort was weakly defended. The British quickly captured it, seized its treasure trove of supplies, and destroyed French ships, gaining control of Lake Ontario. Meanwhile, Brigadier General John Forbes led an expedition to capture Fort Duquesne with nearly 7,000 soldiers. He built a new road through Pennsylvania for better transport and communication. 40 miles from Fort Duquesne, the British filled Fort Ligonier. From there, they tried to learn French plans. On September 14th, Major James Grant led 840 men to scout Fort Duquesne. Grant's men used drummers during the march, alerting the French to the attack. The French, along with their native allies, overwhelmed Grant's men. Grant was captured, and only 525 men made it back to Fort Ligonier. Despite this setback, Forbes' army kept moving. The French and their native allies attacked Fort Ligonier on October 12th but failed. On November 24th, Forbes' men, now at Fort Ligonier, heard an explosion in the distance. The next day, they found Fort Duquesne in ruins, destroyed by the French before they fled. The British built Fort Pitt on the ruins, named after William Pitt, of course. Part 5. The Empire Strikes Back. William Pitt opened the year 1759 with new plans. James Wolfe, who had returned to Britain after his success at Louisbourg, was sent back to America in early 1759. He was given command of 12,000 troops and a fleet to attack Quebec via sailing up the St. Lawrence River. At the same time, Amherst was tasked with planning an invasion of Canada by way of New York. He was to rebuild Fort Oswego and hope to attack Fort Niagara. Amherst assigned Brigadier General John Prideaux in May to rebuild Fort Oswego. They were joined by William Johnson and 1,000 Iroquois. Though previously neutral, the French defeats in 1758 convinced the Iroquois that the French were weak, and also, by taking Fort Niagara, they could redirect some of the fur trade into Iroquois hands. By July 4, 1759, the British and Iroquois reached their destination. Captain Bouchot, in charge of Fort Niagara, was shocked by the British approach. The fort was strong, but its defenders were outnumbered. As the British began constructing the siege works, Prideaux was killed on July 19th by an accidental shot, and Johnson took command. 6 days later, a British force ambushed incoming French reinforcements, causing them to retreat. Fort Niagara surrendered soon after. Meanwhile, General Amherst assembled 7,000 troops by June. He used these men to advance on Fort Ticonderoga. Though his army was met with cannon fire, the much smaller French garrison soon blew up and abandoned the fort. Fort St. Frederick was also blown up in the retreat soon after. Amherst decided to rebuild the forts rather than pushing further into Canada, delaying the invasion. Now, it was time for General Wolfe to make his move. Wolfe left England on February 14, 1759, with Vice Admiral Charles Saunders. They reached Halifax on April 30th, but ice blocked them from Louisbourg Harbor for 2 weeks. Wolfe's forces were smaller than their promised 12,000, with fewer than 9,000 regular troops at his disposal. Nonetheless, Wolfe had a strong team of officers supporting him. Wolfe's army sailed up the St. Lawrence River with a fleet of 49 warships and 119 supply vessels, arriving on the Ile d'Orléans outside Quebec on June 27th. Quebec was well situated on a plateau. Tall cliffs protected the city from almost all sides except from the west. Wolfe had to carefully decide where to attack. Wolfe first considered landing on the north side or further upriver, but found these options risky. Montcalm, in command of 15,000 regulars and militia in the city, believed Wolfe would attack between Quebec and the Montmorency River to the city's west, so he fortified the north bank of the river. However, the French were already growing desperate. The harvest and winter of 1758 to 1759 was the worst in living memory, leaving the defenders with empty stomachs and reliant on whatever resupplies from France could slip by the British blockades. On June 30th, Robert Monckton set up cannons opposite Quebec to bombard the city. Wolfe's forces tried landing near the Montmorency River, but faced heavy resistance and lost many men. Wolfe then attempted another landing on July 31st, but the plan failed, resulting in more casualties. Morale was draining. Wolfe, ill with a fever and frustrated, asked his officers for a new plan. They suggested landing west of Quebec to cut off the French supply lines. Wolfe agreed, and prepared for a new landing at a nearby cove. On the night of September 12th, Wolfe's men quietly sailed to the cove, disembarked, and began scaling the 175-foot tall cliffs. By dawn, the British were on the Plains of Abraham, a flat area west of Quebec. The British were able to push back light French patrols before news reached the French of the landing. Upon hearing the news, Montcalm decided to attack immediately without waiting for reinforcements. The 4,500-strong French force began firing when the British were in sight, but they were too out of reach to make any significant impact. The British, however, held their fire until the French were very close, just 6 yards away, and unleashed a deadly volley. The French line broke, and Montcalm's forces retreated. Montcalm was mortally wounded in the battle, and Wolfe himself was shot 3 times. As Wolfe lay dying surrounded by his officers, he heard of the French retreat. "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace," declared Wolfe's final words. Quebec was now finally in British hands. "1759 ended with more victories for the British, though in the form of massacre. General Amherst, aware of the delays in his plans in New York, sent Major Robert Rogers and 200 men to attack the Christian indigenous town of St. Francis, near the St. Lawrence River, about 50 miles south of Montreal. He reached the town on October 3rd, and at dawn attacked. Rogers' men killed anyone and burned any hut they came across. A hidden group of soldiers ambushed those who tried to escape. Rogers reported finding 600 scalps by the end of the fiasco. Rogers then made a frantic retreat back to more friendly ground, losing 49 men in the pursuit. 1759 was also an annus mirabilis of many British triumphs worldwide. They captured French posts in India and even beat back a siege of Madras, invaded and took the island of Guadeloupe in the West Indies, and defeated the French army at Minden in Germany. The final blow came on November 20th, when Admiral Sir Edward Hawke shattered the French fleet at Quiberon Bay off the coast of Brittany, stopping France's planned invasion of Great Britain and breaking France's naval power in the process. Part 6. The Collapse of the French Empire. After Quebec fell and General Montcalm died, General Lévis took over and knew they needed help from France fast. He asked for soldiers, cannons, and supplies, but France, facing a British naval blockade, could not send much. Things were so bad that the French government wondered if saving Canada was even worth it, since the colonies struggled to sustain itself even in peace. Corruption in the supply lines made things worse. In the end, France sent a small number of soldiers and food, which the British quickly captured. Despite this, General Lévis didn't wait around. In April 1760, he led an army of 7,000 toward Quebec, pushing his men to move quickly. The British, led by the new governor of Quebec, James Murray, met them on April 28th. Murray's forces were outnumbered. Though they had some early success, the French forces overpowered them. The British retreated, losing most of the cannons. Lévis laid siege to Quebec, but British troops arrived on May 15th. Lévis was forced to retreat back to Montreal, with Murray following in pursuit. New France's situation kept getting worse. General Amherst led 10,000 men from Lake Ontario to attack Montreal. At the same time, William Haviland moved up from Lake Champlain. Lévis told his men to pull back to the St. Lawrence and Richelieu rivers, but they were overwhelmed. By August 31st, Murray's army arrived east of Montreal, with Haviland close behind, while Amherst arrived at the west end of Montreal on September 6th. Faced with this three-pronged attack, the Canadian militia abandoned Lévis en masse. Only the French regulars stood their ground. With no chance of winning, Governor Vaudreuil decided to surrender. A treaty was signed on September 8th, giving all of Canada to the British. The treaty also promised to protect trade, the Catholic Church, and private property. General Lévis, unwilling to surrender easily, burned his battalion's flags and smashed the sword over his knee as a final act of defiance. The next day, Amherst sent Robert Rogers to take control of New France's western forts. Rogers reached Fort Detroit on November 29th and raised the British flag there. Other squads did the same in French forts in Indiana and Michigan. Amherst then set up a temporary government in Canada, dividing it into 3 districts with a military governor in Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal. Life for the Canadians went on much as before while they waited. hoping a future definite peace treaty would return Canada to France. Though the fighting stopped in Canada, it was ignited in the South. The Cherokee, an indigenous group local to the Carolinas and Tennessee, had about 10,000 people spread across 40 towns. They were trusted traders for the Carolinians, and often sold captives from other tribes as slaves to British traders. Some Cherokee even joined Forbes' expedition in 1758. But tensions began to rise when the British built 4 new settlements and 2 forts on Cherokee land, including Fort Loudon, built too close for comfort near their capital, Chota. Border skirmishes broke out in 1759. When Cherokee leaders went to Charleston to talk peace, the British took them hostage. Governor William Littleton of South Carolina cut off their ammunition supply and led a militia to Fort Prince George, the second of the new forts, in November to apply pressure. In February 1760, the Cherokee tried to capture Fort Prince George to free the hostages but failed. The British killed the Cherokee hostages in retaliation. Cherokee warriors proceeded to attack frontier settlements in South Carolina, killing many settlers and traders. Meanwhile, Fort Loudon in Tennessee was under siege. The British garrison surrendered after months of starvation on August 8th. On their way to safety to Fort Prince George, their Cherokee escorts attacked, killing 35. In 1761, James Grant led over 2,800 men to Fort Prince George and proceeded to destroy Cherokee towns systematically, forcing them to negotiate peace. A treaty signed in December set a boundary between the indigenous and white settlements, demanded the return of white captives, and required the Cherokee to execute any future attackers. After Canada fell, many French officials were sent back to France. The loss was not received well in France, leading to an investigation that revealed corruption. Supplies meant for troops were often sold to traders first, who then sold them at inflated prices. Some officials spent their gains on gambling and other carnal vices. Governor Vaudreuil and 41 others were arrested, with many fined, jailed, or exiled. Meanwhile, France lost its last base in India and began peace talks with Britain. Spain, which had joined the war late, faced losses as well. In 1762, Spain tried to invade Portugal, but ended up losing Havana and the rest of Cuba, along with the Philippines and its capital Manila, to the British. The new British king, George III, wanted peace, against the wishes of William Pitt, who favored continuing the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed on February 10, 1763. It ended the French and Indian War in North America and the 7 Years' War in Europe and beyond. Britain gained Canada and all French lands east of the Mississippi River, except New Orleans. Islands taken in the Caribbean were returned to their original owners, including Cuba, which was given back to Spain in exchange for Florida to the British. In compensation, France gave New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana to Spain, effectively removing France from mainland North America, and thus virtually ending its colonial empire. After 4 long and bloody wars, Great Britain had won the war for empire. The continent was now largely under British rule. Spain, the other major colonial power, was too far away to be a threat. With France defeated, British colonists in America felt safer than ever. Britain was now the strongest power in Europe and one of the largest colonial powers in the world. However, this victory was a disaster for the indigenous. They had once played the British and French powers against each other to protect their own independence and trade. Now, with only the British left, even the tribes who had sided with them were deemed no longer useful and were pushed aside. Even then, they became more independent on British goods and connections to survive. When the British took over French forts beyond the Appalachian Mountains, many colonists moved into native territories, often cheating and mistreating the tribes. The sale of guns and ammunition to the native tribes slowed, and the British stopped the French practice of giving gifts to keep good relations. The government also did little to stop settlers from moving onto native lands, where tribes like the Shawnee, Wyandot, and Delaware had lived relatively undisturbed. In 1761, a Delaware prophet named Neolin began urging his people to stop trading with the Europeans, take up traditional rituals, and return to the traditional ways of life. His message resonated deeply with many tribes who had suffered from the war and settler expansion. Inspired by Neolin, an Ottawa leader named Pontiac rose up and led a siege on Fort Detroit in 1763 with 400 warriors, killing and capturing many. News of the attack spread, and other tribes also began to rise up against the local British garrisons. Violence also spread to the frontiers of Virginia and Pennsylvania, where settlers and the indigenous committed brutal acts of violence against each other. One violent group, the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, killed and scalped 6 innocent Conestogas, and proceeded to incite a bloodthirsty mob that was broken up under the threat of cannon fire. By 1764, the indigenous rebels were running out of supplies and were unable to continue fighting. Many wanted to return to peace and trade to resume. The British, eager to end the costly conflict, sent Thomas Gage to negotiate. He was advised to show respect to the tribes and offer gifts, which proved to be a cheaper option than continuing the war. From 1764 to 1766, the British used this approach to make peace with the tribes. By the end of the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, the British government had accrued a massive amount of debt, to the tune of £140 million. It began to look to the American colonies as its new source of income to help pay off this debt. The Sugar Act in 1764 acted as a customs duty to foreign goods, while the Stamp Act in 1765 taxed goods traveling within the colonies. The Stamp Act was economically devastating to local economies and became so unpopular with the colonists that it was repealed a year later, especially since many felt angry at the fact that they were being taxed without any representation in Britain's Parliament. To add to this, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 forbade settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains and designated the land west of it as indigenous territory, invalidating the whole reason why Britain went to war in America in the first place, to conquer and settle the Ohio Valley. And with France gone, many American colonists began to wonder if they even needed the British overlords in the first place. Perhaps America would be better off independent.